thank you all for coming. I would just like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are each located. I acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory I stand today, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanek peoples whose historical relationships with the land continues to this day. I'm in Victoria, BC. I'm very pleased to introduce to you our four speakers today. I'll give you each of their bios, and then we'll play their pre-recorded presentations. At the end, we'll then have our live chat. So I'll be monitoring the chat as we go, but you can also feel free to ask your questions at the end with video and audio, or just audio, whatever you'd like. So our first presenter today is Catherine Acheson. She's a professor of English and Associate Dean of Arts at the University of Waterloo. Her books include Early Modern English Marginalia, Visual Rhetoric, and Early Modern English Literature, The Memoir of 1603 and the Diary of 1616 to 1619, which is an Anne Clifford, and writing essays about literature. She is currently working on 17th century female author portraits and some questions about marginalia and research methodology, and editing the section of the Palgrave Encyclopedia of Early Modern Women's Writing called Materialities, Print.
I want to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Attawandaron, or Neutral, and Anishinaabe peoples. My home and my place of work are situated on land promised to the Six Nations, the Haldimand Tract. This is but one broken promise in the long and treacherous history of the relationships between imperial powers and their settler agents and Indigenous peoples in Canada. This land acknowledgement provides a frame for the paper, which is about the use of the beaver as a symbol of nation in European maps of Canada from the 17th and 18th centuries. Samuel de Champlain's maps, as D.A. Brownstein writes, transformed what Europeans were accustomed to imagining as frozen wilderness into the image of a land of viable trading partners, rich in beaver and otter pelts, cod, and fruits. This map, published in 1612, displayed the potential to its European audience, including investors in Champlain's voyages and the trading infrastructure of vast quantities of valuable commodities and profit from the bounty of the New World. The Champlain beaver is found in the place where beaver pelts can be obtained. The potential trading partners for Champlain and the French are Indigenous people. In the map, Indigenous peoples are represented inhabiting and using the territory, but they are also depicted in the decorative margins of the map. The Indigenous peoples represented in the panel on the lower left-hand corner of the map are Innu, known to Champlain as the Montagnais, and the Etechemani. They are peoples with whom Champlain has already forged alliances. Champlain hoped that they would continue to facilitate this access to the lucrative fur trade. They are represented in the empirical style of 16th century scientific illustration and proto-ethnography. The Indigenous North Americans depicted in this map are both people in their own right, with societies, technologies, and territorial identities, and exotic specimens from the vast cornucopia of life forms and objects cataloged in the new sciences of the early modern era and defined by the increasingly powerful and complex practices of imperialism. Mapmaking played a powerful role in the development of the concept of the nation state. According to Jordan Branch, quote, the treatment of political authority exclusively in terms of homogeneous territorial areas separated by discrete boundary lines, unquote, is unique to the modern state system and results directly from mapmaking. As early as 1650, nation was used to refer specifically to, quote, a North American Indian people and the territory occupied by such people, unquote. But the design of this map insinuates for these Indigenous people a separation from territory, between territory as nation and people as nation. The map foretells the persistent displacement of Indigenous people from the places in which they lived. There is, however, a nation in this picture. France, which is depicted through the language of the map, the coat of arms of the monarchy, the ships which dot the waters, and the technology which produces the map. As a nation, France imagines itself extended and renewed through the addition of the territory and objects displayed in the map. For the map's primary audience, educated, ambitious, affluent French people, maps such as this one show them what it means to be an imperial power, to reorganize and revivify their economy using resources from far away, and ultimately to displace the people who live there to the edges, sometimes decorative, sometimes incognito. Herman Mall's 18th century redrawing of a signal vignette from Nicholas Defferre's 1698 map shows beavers walking on their hind legs and using their front legs as we do our arms. They are busy chopping wood and carrying it to a distant destination. As animals, the beavers are of nature, but as purposeful, organized, industrious creatures, they are social and economic beings. But these beavers look like human drones or slaves. The latter part of the 17th century, as we know, saw the rapid expansion and intensification of the trade in slaves from Africa. Indigenous North Americans were also enslaved to labor in tobacco, rice, and indigo fields in the American South, and to be sold to the Caribbean and North American colonies. It is estimated that between 1670 and 1715, 30,000 to 50,000 North American Indigenous people were taken captive and sold to plantation owners. And quote, until the late 18th century, Indian slaves worked on English plantations alongside. Defferre's or Mall's beavers have the air of automatons or assembly line workers following each other in an entranced line. This depiction of beavers was widely circulated through the 18th century. It was published in The World Displayed, which first appeared in 1759 to 1760 in 20 volumes. It went through many more editions and redactions in the remainder of the 18th century and was first published in North America in 1795. This work was compiled by the poets Oliver Goldsmith and Christopher Smart with the lexicographer Samuel Johnson, who wrote the introduction. The text in this work about beavers also anthropomorphizes them. The beavers, for instance, quote, load themselves with grass and earth, which they drag upon their great tails and throw in between the wood with such art and industry that it would be very difficult, if not impossible, for man to make a stronger wall with such materials. Their tails serve them both for carts and trowels, and their teeth for axes. Their paws supply the place of hands, and their feet serve instead of oars. So beavers are not just natural resources, they are naturally occurring tools, organic machines. They provide for themselves while they work to build the civilization of others. Again, many decades after the first publication of Defferre's illustration in 1698, this image refers to a nation, but the nation is the nation that thrives on the subject labor of others, an imperial European nation. The publication of the illustration of The World Displayed coincided with the final battles between the French and English in North America. The first publication of Defferre's map coincided with the worst of what are known as the Beaver Wars, struggles between First Nations that were underpinned by the contest between European powers to control the beaver fur trade. Beavers in these images stand for these resources, both human and natural, that the victorious nations would possess, and the potential for a society built from or by those resources. The map entitled North America, performed under the patronage of Louis, Duke of Orleans, first Prince of the Blood, was originally published in 1746. Its designer was the great French cartographer, Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville. It was translated into English and re-engraved by Walker, possibly Anthony Walker, quote, one of the most gifted engravers of the period, known for topographical views, religious and genre subjects, portraits, and book illustrations. It was delineated by one Gravelet and greatly improved by Mr. Solomon Bolton. This chain of production and reproduction, adaptation or improvement is typical of 18th century print culture, in which maps were both ideological and decorative objects. This map of North America features two cherubs, one of which is holding a fish, a larger toothed fish, a beaver, and a female figure dressed only in a discreetly arranged piece of drapery. The female figure is evidently supposed to represent Indigenous peoples. She is topped with a feather headdress and holds a bow in her left hand, while her right rests on the feathered ends of arrows in a quiver. Her complexion is pale. She seems to represent original purity, the uncorrupted white flesh of Eden, and conforms to classical aesthetic models of the female body, slender and soft with an alabaster sheen. The feather headdress she wears acts as a crown. The salient characteristics of First Nations dress, as depicted in other maps and publications, have been absorbed into this figure of empire, served by angelic cherubs, the bounty of the sea, and the harvest of the land. The beaver in this illustration is has a very interesting pedigree. It is copied from a collection of illustrated Aesop's fables published by Francis Barlow in 1666 and 1687. In that image, the beaver is behaving according to the story of the fable and prepares to bite off its own testicles. Barlow's images, however, are famous for their naturalism and realism and are strongly informed by scientific illustration. It was not uncommon for images of animals to move back and forth between fable and emblem and scientific works, although this is the first instance of which I am aware of a Barlow illustration moving into a scientific context. In the map, however, the beaver's groin is concealed by the female figure's legs, and it appears to be defending her rather than mutilating itself. The toothed fish has taken the place of the predatory dog in the Barlow scene. The beaver in Bolton's map then is a defender of empire. Displaced from the map itself into the insignia that frames the content of the map for its audience, the beaver here is no longer a sign of place, but a reference to the commodity that undergirded the empire and gave it strength. This map was composed, engraved, translated, and re-engraved during a few of the many years of intense Anglo-French rivalry in the international arena, some of which occasioned fighting in North America and some of which had consequences in North America. Both the wars and the battles that took place in North America and the settlement of conflicts that happened outside of North America were related to the beaver fur trade. As the animals became more and more scarce over the course of the 18th century, and international competition intensified as a result. Because the map was originally French and then translated and re-engraved into English during a time of mounting tension and episodic conflict between the two imperial nations, it offers us a witness of the struggle between them. In the large text block inserted in the Atlantic, Bolton claims that the map is intended, quote, to ascertain the just rights, unquote, of Britain. He says that D'Anville's boundary of New Scotland is an arbitrary fiction and false and unjust. D'Anville's north-south boundary from the St. Lawrence to Georgia is a romantic presumption void of all authority. According to Bolton, national prejudice and imperial ambition have driven the famously scrupulous D'Anville to fantasize, quote, "'Tis an idle vanity to suppose a dotted line in a French map will exclude the English from all those nations where their trade and dominion so visibly extend. Wherefore, the whole must remain without any boundary line at all," unquote. Bolton's words also raise questions about the definition and nature of the concept of nation. Bolton is assertive in calling Indigenous societies nations, claiming that the English rights over lands D'Anville assigns to the French are due to legally binding treaties and contracts that Great Britain has entered into with First Nations. Quote, "All the land south of the St. Lawrence River is the original property of the Five Nations with their allies and tributaries. The French can have no shadow of pretense to any part of this country, and their settlement about Lake Champlain is a mere depredation, contrary to our title, which is entirely derived from agreement and purchase." But there is some ambiguity in the designation. Bolton writes that, quote, "The six Indian nations, named Iroquois by the French, are subjects and allies of Great Britain, and so declared by the Treaty of Utrecht. Being both subjects and allies is obviously a contradictory position. The absorption of details of First Nations regalia and technology into the imperial queen depicted in the title cartouche serves to illustrate this ambiguity. This figure is nativized European, not so much a hybrid as an absorbent and malleable creature capable of adopting the identity of the one while retaining the essential properties of the other. The beaver functions similarly and can be seen as analogous to the First Nations in Bolton's texts, an independent ally, but also a subordinate, one whose power serves to protect and enhance the power of the imperial nation, or rather whose fur serves to fuel the expansion of European economies around the world. I want to close by briefly mentioning Christy Belcour's work, Good Land, which reproduces an 1865 map on one side of the paper and reinscribes, quote, some original place names and markings that show an Indigenous worldview on the other. And her beautiful work with Indigenous mapping practices. Belcour cites the geographer Bernard Nietschmein. More Indigenous territory has been stolen with mapping than by guns. The three maps of which I've spoken are good examples of how that theft was organized and executed. The beaver as a symbol helped in each of these. In the Champlain map, the beaver is an example of how natural resources that belong to a place can be exploited to feed the imperial drive of a distant nation. In the De Fer Mall illustration, the beavers are uncanny versions of people who will be subordinated and dehumanized to the will of the empire. In the Danville, we see the beaver conscripted to both define and defend empire. We should know these things when we see the beaver on the back of a nickel or the front of a sweatshirt, and we should feel empowered by that knowledge to leave it behind.